Podcasting Smarter. For business communications, training, and marketing, Corporate Podcasting Smarter is for enterprise-level and professional organizations and is an official podcast from Podbean. We feature interviews with industry experts, learning and development use cases, podcast network advertising best practices, and helpful tips for how to get the most out of podcasting within your organization or media network.
So welcome everyone to Corporate Podcasting Smarter and our March live event, The Power of Influence, Strategies for Effective Leadership, with Scott Mautz, leadership expert, keynote speaker, and author of Leading from the Middle. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Corporate Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one, along with exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast. We are brought to you by Podbean. We're a private podcast hosting solution for Fortune 100 companies with secure encrypted podcasting and a proven track record within the industry. Head over to podbean.com/enterprise to learn more about our business and our enterprise solutions. And now we'll get started and hand it off to Scott. Hello and welcome.
Hello. Great to be here. So glad to be here. So excited. Got so much to share with the audience today.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll get started. Here we go.
Here we go. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Scott Mautz. I'm here to talk to you about Leading from the Middle. It draws from my award-winning book, Leading from the Middle. The subtitle is A Playbook for Managers to Influence Up, Down, and Across the Organization. It is a love letter to the most powerful people within a company, the unspoken heroes, the middle managers. I'm going to give you strategies today on how to excel from this very, very tricky role, maybe the trickiest role in all of corporate America, if you will, the role of the middle manager. And we're going to start with a visual that you might not be expecting. This one right here. Let me ask you this. Have you ever heard the term monkey in the middle? It refers to a childhood game that I used to play when I was a kid. It's essentially another name for the game of keep away. A child stands in the center of a circle and a bunch of kids circle around him and they have a ball and they play keep away from the monkey, the kid, in the center of the circle. Well, I didn't have any reason really to even think about this game for decades and decades and decades. And then suddenly it got thrust into my kind of psyche, if you will, based on the nature of the research work I do. When I came across a study from the universities of Manchester and Liverpool, in which researchers were studying the life cycle and the lifestyles, if you will, of monkeys. They had over 600 monkeys in their study, and they were kind of breaking down the behaviors and carefully watching the behaviors within the pack of monkeys. And they were recording all those behaviors carefully. They would record all the, aggressive behaviors like chases and threats and slaps and screaming at one another. They would record all the gentle behaviors like nurturing and grooming and hugging. And so as they were recording all these behaviors, when they got done, then they would collect stool samples and fecal matter of the monkeys to measure them for stress hormone levels. Not a job that I would like, I can guarantee you that. Here's what the researchers found. They found, after measuring the stress hormones in the fecal matter of the monkeys that they collected, they found that the monkeys that were the most physically and emotionally stressed out in the entire monkey organization, the entire monkey hierarchy, were the monkeys in the middle of the monkey hierarchy. Not the ones that were in charge of the whole thing, not the ones that were still so young they didn't even know anything yet and they had to prove themselves, right? It was the monkeys that were right in the middle of the hierarchy. And as it turns out, the monkeys' slightly less bright cousins, the human beings, it turns out to be the same thing. In a huge study of over 320,000 employees, the study showed that the bottom 5% amongst those 320,000 employees, in terms of happiness engagement, the bottom 5% of those employees weren't employees that had bad performance ratings. They were employees that actually had really good performance ratings or even great performance ratings. They just happened to be employees that lied in the middle of their organization's hierarchy. Make no mistake, operating in the middle is tricky and it's stressful. First, though, let's get on the same page of what I mean by middle manager so that we know we're all talking the same thing. In case if you're thinking, well, wait a minute, interesting, Scott, but I'm not a middle manager. Now, hold on a second. My definition of a middle manager is anybody who has a boss and is a boss or aspires to be one someday and must lead up, down, and across the organization to be able to do their job well. In other words, they have to be able to lead up to the boss and up to the boss's boss and lead their thinking. They have to be able to lead down, lead their employees. They have to be able to lead across the organization, to lead people over whom they have no formal authority. Unless if you're the CEO of your organization, the odds are you fit this description that you are at some level indeed a middle manager, and your job couldn't be more difficult. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the scope of the middle manager's job. And I mean that in a couple of ways. First of all, I mean it literally. But literally, the scope of the middle manager's job is unlike any other job in corporate America. It is massive. So many hats you have to wear. But I also mean scope in the sense of an acronym. We interviewed and surveyed thousands and thousands of successful middle managers to find out what makes their job so difficult. It turned out to be 5 things, all of which add up to spell the acronym SCOPE. What are those 5 things that make a middle manager's job so tricky? Self-identity, conflict, omnipotence, then physical and emotional stress. And I'll explain each one of these. Let's start with self-identity. What's so difficult? What do I mean by a self-identity issue? Well, what I mean by that is that middle managers almost by default wear hundreds and hundreds of hats each day. And I'm sure many of you can really kind of associate with this. You have to engage in what psychologists and even neuroscientists now call micro transitions. This means that you switch roles all day long, back and forth, micro transitions. You fire back and forth all day long. For example, one moment you take a deferential stance with your boss, and then the next moment you're taking an assertive mode with your employees, and then the next moment you're in collaborative mode with your peers. There are moments when you're experiencing high autonomy and a freedom to operate and empowerment. And then the next moment you feel like a cog in the great wheel within the organization with lots of responsibility, but too little authority. You bounce back and forth, right? You might be in a meeting and you're running the meeting. Then suddenly you have to jump into a role you weren't expecting to play because your boss enters the room, right? And that's further exacerbated, by the way, with poorly defined roles where you're not even really sure what your role is. And you have unclear expectations around that, and you're thinking, well, what's really my role? These micro transitions that you have to fire through all day long, they add up and they subconsciously exhaust us as a middle manager. And it creates this self-identity issue. Scope, the next challenge that we face, the letter C, is conflict. And what I mean by that is, it's almost by definition, the middle manager is surrounded on all sides by conflict. Almost by the very nature of being in the middle of an organization, right? Your boss cajoles you, your employees resist you, you get peers that just won't collaborate. You have to absorb discontent from every angle. You got conflicting agendas, conflicts of interest, interpersonal conflict to manage through. You're constantly putting out fires, right? That get in the way of doing the very job that you're being asked to do, but you can't get to that job because you're too busy putting out fires. You disagree with decisions that are handed down to you, and yet you're in conflict with that, but you have to be the one that explains those decisions to your organization and show up sometimes like you believe in them, even though you may not even understand them. And then your people may ask for, understanding of that decision made, and you don't even agree with this. How are you supposed to explain it? There's conflict all day long as a middle manager. Why else is the job so hard? Because of the O in scope, omnipotence. And what I mean by this is you're often expected to know everything in your role, right? If you're a brand manager, you better know the share in Peoria, Illinois of your product, right? You're expected to know all the details, how your product stands with every retail customer that you sell in, right? And you're expected to know so much, including how to grow other people, despite sometimes a lack of investment in you personally by your boss or your organization. And without time to grow yourself, there's this aura of omnipotence that you're expected to have when you operate in the middle. Then we get to P, the physical, right? We talked about this up front with that study of the monkeys, that it is really stressful to operate in the middle. The constant micro switching, the stress and the anxiety begins to take its toll on you over time. And that also adds up to the emotional toll that it could take. I mean, here's the truth. Being a middle manager, it can lead to alienation, isolation, loneliness. Being in the middle, it makes it hard to be part of anyone's group at times, right? And if you've been a middle manager, you know what I'm talking about. Bosses and employees, they could stay at arm's length, and yet you can often absorb everybody's discontent, even though people don't necessarily always want to get close to you. You can feel overworked and underappreciated. You want to change things, but you don't always feel like you have the ability to do so. You can't control enough of your own destiny. It's this scope of issues that makes the job of middle manager so tricky and so difficult. But that's okay, because I want you to remember that you could do a number of things to reframe the job of middle manager. In the book, you're going to find a series of powerful reframes that we heard from the best middle managers out there, where they said, yes, my job is very, very difficult as a middle manager, but I look at my job differently. I've mentally reframed it in a different way. Let me give you just a few examples from the book of a couple of different reframes. First, in the upper left-hand corner, we heard some middle managers tell us that their job is like an integrated puzzle. Yes, they go through a lot of different hats. They wear a lot of different hats, but those 100 different jobs that you have to play, they're not segregated and separate. They're integrated into one role made up of 100 different roles that you are uniquely skilled to operate in. It's something to be really proud of. Another reframe we heard. I really like this one. I like this so much, I spelled it out and shared it in the book, and I never forgot it. One middle manager, really successful, said, look, the best middle managers, they think like an engineer, but they feel like an artist. They think like an engineer. They're process driven. They're really sharp. They know how to get things done. They're orderly. They're mechanical almost at times when they need to be. At the same time, they feel like an artist. They lead with their heart. They have high EQ. They show empathy. Another way to reframe the difficult role. Here's a couple more. We also heard one that I really liked a lot, where somebody said they saw their job as a middle manager to be the keeper of the long and the short-term flame. Meaning they saw their job as they are the ones in the middle. They were uniquely suited to work on the business and in the business. On the business, to paint an interesting and exciting, compelling vision. In the business, to know the details and be able to run operationally day to day. What a skill that is to have. One last reframe that I'll share with you. We heard the idea of a lighthouse come up a lot. That the best middle managers think of themselves, despite the scope of issues they have, they think of themselves as a lighthouse. They're a beacon that draws you towards the right things to be inspired by and the right opportunities. And they also warn you of dangers, and they look around corners and things to avoid to help people avoid problems and operate more smoothly in their job. The point is, and you'll find out in the book, plenty of ways to mentally reframe the way you think about your job, and it's worth it to do so. Let me give you just 3 facts to point out how important middle managers are to their organization and why you should take pride in the role of being a middle manager in your organization. First stat, that number you see there, 25%. What this means is simply this, get ready for this. Middle managers are responsible for 25% of the variation in the average organization's revenue, which is 3 times more than people who work just in innovation roles where their only job is to increase revenue for the company. Another stat, another number, the number 5. That stands for a 5-year study from Stanford University that showed replacing a poor middle manager with even an average middle manager is the equivalent to actually adding an entire net new person to the team. Talk about a productivity boost. One last statistic to show you should be proud. The number 20%, it has been shown that a talented middle manager can reduce the desire for employees to quit, quitting, if you will, by 20%. Just by themselves. No other tactic, just having a skilled middle manager. The point here, folks, is simply this. Take pride. Take pride in these 3 numbers. Take pride in the fact that you are at the center of your organization. You are in a pivotal role for your organization. You're not stuck in the middle. You have a chance to lead in every direction, up down, and across the organization. And I'm going to give you some tools to do that right now. I talked up front about the book. I'm very proud of Leading from the Middle. The subtitle is a playbook for managers to influence up, down, and across the organization, 360 degrees, right? Because influence is leadership. And in the book, I talk a lot about the unique challenges. I go more deeply into scope, why the job is so hard, right? I talk about the mindset and the skill set. I touched on that briefly where I was talking about ways you can mentally reframe the job to be in the right mindset to do it. I go a lot into the skill set. I talk a lot about how to dramatically increase your influence in all directions. And I even go deeply into how to lead change, which may be one of the most important roles of the middle manager, because they're the ones that are closest to change headed down from above and the ones that actually have to execute that change. What I'm going to focus the rest of my time with you on is right there in the center. I want to give you some really powerful strategies and tips, just a couple of each, for how to manage up, manage your boss and your boss's boss, how to manage down, manage your employees, and how to manage across those people over whom you have no formal influence, just to give you a flavor of the power of this book, Leading from the Middle, and how you can step up your game being a person who leads from the middle of an organization. Let's start with leading up. A couple of strategies for how to lead up in your organization. And in the book, you'll see this diagram, this figure here. I'm getting old, folks, now, so these days I need my readers to see my own screen here. So you'll find in the book something called the managing up staircase. It took almost 3 years to develop and to validate. And it's 6 steps that you can follow. It's a proven process to follow on how to create a deeper, more powerful relationship with your boss and how to be able to influence him or her even more strongly. We make a lot of mistakes in this, right? A lot of us, we know that one of the largest reasons people leave their job is they don't get along with their manager. You can change that. You can change the relationship with your boss, but you got to do it right. And you got to follow the right process. In the book, you'll see there's 6 steps. I talk about the importance of nature before nurture and understanding the ask, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. I talk about the importance of being aware of their style. And, your ability to get along with your boss is only as good as how well you understand their specific style in certain ways, and you can adapt to that style. I talk about the next step of now you get personal, right? And you get to know your boss. A lot of people make the mistake and say, the first step is to really know my boss, drill in, get to know them as a person. And that's actually not the first step you should be taking, but it's one you should eventually take. You'll learn about the 5th step, which is, getting your house in order and showing up in control of your job all the ways your boss wants you to. And you'll learn about the last, maybe even more important step of providing purposeful support for your boss, supporting your boss in all the ways he or she, statistically speaking, wants to be supported. But like I said, for now, in our time, I want to focus on these first 2 steps, right? This idea of nature before nurture and understanding the ask. Let's start with that step 1, what I call nature before nurture. Here's the basic truth. You see, a lot of people make the mistake in a relationship of the reason why so many relationships go bad is people tend to expect too much from their boss. They want their boss to be perfect. And when the boss doesn't show up to be perfect, they start to label them. They hold everything against them. But I want you to understand a fundamental truth. The nature of a boss-subordinate relationship that you need to understand before you can nurture that relationship. And it is this simple statement, if you will. A boss-subordinate relationship is the interdependence between 2 imperfect human beings. And I just want you to pause and sit with that for a minute. The boss-subordinate relationship is the interdependence between 2 imperfect human beings, meaning it's interdependent in that you need him or her, and she needs you just as much. And neither one of you are perfect. If you could start with that assumption, you're going to get off to a much better start, and you're going to be a lot more forgiving. You're going to resist the temptation to label your boss and all of their foibles. Step 1. Let's go on to the next step, which is understanding the asks. And what I mean by this is get really clear on expectations of your boss. Now, here's the thing. We conducted some research with over 200 pairs of bosses and subordinates, right? I call it the FBI research lovingly because we took the boss and we put that person in one room and we put the employee in a separate room so that they couldn't hear what the other person was saying. Then we asked the boss in that room, what do you think your employee expects of you? And then we asked the employee, what do you think your boss expects of you? We found in over 80% of the situations, there were material breaches in the most basic understanding. The most basic of understanding. So the point is, you're not as clear on expectations as you think you are. It's really important to understand the asks. Now, in the book, you will find a series of really powerful questions that you can ask your boss to get super clear on expectations. One of those questions is, what's the difference between good and great? And let me show you just how powerful this question could be. On your screen here, you see what I call the good to great grid that really brings this concept to life on getting clear with your boss on what they think the difference is between good and great. Here's how it works. Imagine you sat down with your boss and you had a simple grid laid out to discuss this with them, right? And you wanted to find out, in this case, for the simple example, what's the difference between good leadership and great leadership? Good risk taking and great, good priority setting and great priority setting, right? And then you sit down and you talk with your boss about it, forcing them to define the difference between good and great. You literally write that down, and then you go from there. Let me give you an example. Let's look at priority setting. Say you sat down with your boss and you define together that, and this is from a real example that I did with a real team. And we sat down and we said, okay, good priority setting is what I call trash compactor management. Trash compactor is a machine that takes a big chunk of trash and it squeezes it down into a smaller cube. And if you think about your work that way, that, if you could say no to some things, if you could prioritize and make your cube of work smaller, that's pretty good because most people aren't very good at that, right? But that's not necessarily great. Then the team decided, but great priority setting is what I call accordion management. That is, accordion, of course, is a musical instrument. You play it like this, in and out, right? What if you thought of your workload that way? That you are constantly expanding the workload at times when you were the busiest, during a quarterly sales meeting, a big annual meeting, a big meeting with the boss, but then you contracted it on those times in between to rest, to recuperate, to celebrate. You expanded the workload in busy times. You contracted in less busy times. You're constantly adding new work, but reprioritizing and taking old, unimportant work off the plate. In and out you go, prioritizing like an accordion. Now, it's not important that you agree with these two definitions that you see, right? It's not. What's more important is that you actually do this exercise for yourself and you define the difference between the two things. Here's what happens when you do. When you can define, here's the problem. Most bosses, they don't define clearly their expectations because they're not specific enough in the definition, right? So by doing this chart, it forces the boss to be specific. They have to, that tension forces them to define the difference between good and great. And with that tension in place, because they're now forced to not be lazy and define what good is and great is, you get a whole nother level of clarity on expectations. Those are some tips on leading up. Let's go to leading down now, down the organization to your employees. And now, before we go to the next slide, let me just set this up for you. I wanted to focus on the two questions that I get most often from people about managing down to employees, which it's really twofold. Number one, I hear this all the time. How do I pinpoint what my employee really needs to work on, right? Because if you tell somebody to work on something, odds are they're going to work on that, right? So you got to really get it right. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint what their issue is and what they really need to improve on. We're going to talk about that. The second thing people ask me is, and how do I give feedback? How do I get better at sharing feedback? Let's talk about both of those. Let's go to the first one. I want to talk about pinpointing what people need to work on. The first rule of being able to pinpoint what someone needs to work on is to remember this. 90% of the time, their opportunity for improvement lies within the shadow of their strength. I'll give you an example. You have an employee who's fantastic at setting a vision, right? Great strength, but in the shadow of that strength, they're not so good at following through on details, or vice versa. They're really good at details, but they couldn't think a big vision and, if they hit them in the head, right? Another example, you got an employee who's really collaborative, right? But when it comes time to make a decision, they just won't get on with it because they're too busy collaborating, or the opposite, right? They're really decisive, but in the shadow of that strength, they don't collaborate enough with people. They just hammer through decisions. So first rule, 90% of the time, opportunities lie in the shadow of the strength. If you're trying to figure out what someone needs to work on, look there first. Then you can go to what you see on the screen, the attitude versus aptitude check. And let me explain this, and then we'll go to the next slide, but not yet. The attitude versus aptitude check. Here's what I mean. Sometimes asking yourself, is what they have to work on attitude-based or aptitude-based, can be really powerful. For example, let's say you have an employee that works for you and they have to prepare a report and they haven't done a good job with the report, right? It's done poorly. You can ask yourself, okay, is this an attitude problem? Do they not think the report's important? Maybe they don't think that you actually read it. Maybe they think they're above it. Maybe they think someone else should do it. Or is it an aptitude problem? Did anybody show them how to write the report? Did they know how to pull the data that goes behind it? Did they know how to write it up in a way that you like to read it, and so on? So by starting with asking yourself, is it an attitude problem or an aptitude problem? It's a great way to pinpoint what they need to work on. You can even put it in a graph, a 4-quadrant graph, like on this next slide. Think about it this way. I want you to think about aptitude on this axis and attitude on this axis. And here's the way this works. In the first upper right quadrant, let's say you have somebody who, they have great aptitude and a great attitude. Well, what they produce is pretty obvious. There's clear results. There's great thinking. They're really collaborative. Okay, great. Let's go to the lower right quadrant. Right now, remember, you're using attitude, aptitude, this graph, to help you pinpoint what people need to work on and what you should do about that, right? Okay, the lower, let's say the person you're evaluating lies in that lower quadrant, right? This is where their attitude is great, their aptitude not so good, right? Which means, maybe they have unclear results. There's unclear thinking, but they're great collaborators and they have great follow through and they're just great people, right? Now go to the next quadrant. Maybe your person fits in this quadrant, right? Geez, they don't have a good skill set, not high aptitude, and not a great attitude either. So you get unclear results. The thinking's not good. There's poor follow through. There's poor collaboration, right? Then you go to the upper left quadrant, right? Where say your person, they have, great aptitude, great skill set, but their attitude's not so great. What does that look like? Well, yeah, the clear results, but it can come at the expense of, right? They're burning bridges to get those results along the way, right? They're getting things done, but probably culturally not in the way you want. So by graphing all of these quadrants, it helps you figure out, okay, is the problem attitude-based or aptitude-based that they need to work on? And by the way, when you graph it, it also helps you with what to do next about that person. For example, upper right quadrant, right? If you have a person that has really great attitude and great aptitude, you should be focusing on leveraging their strengths. I remember in the corporate world, I had a boss who came in and said, we're not even going to talk about opportunities for the next year. I only want to talk about everybody's strength. You would think that he brought fire down from the mountain. People were so amazed. Like, what are you talking? That's all we're going to talk about is strengths. But we so often don't focus on leveraging our strengths often enough. Let's go to the bottom right quadrant. And I'll be honest with you, this was the hardest one for me as a middle manager to deal with, right? This is where you have a person who has a fantastic attitude, right? That's not the thing they need to work on and fix. But their skill set, it just isn't good enough. Maybe they're not running a strong enough microprocessor up, or maybe they aren't strategic enough. And there comes a point where you got to be honest with yourself on can this person improve enough to be good in the role and excel in the role, or otherwise? Go to the lower left quadrant. This quadrant should be clear, although it's not easy. When you have somebody who's got a terrible attitude and they're not really skilled and not performing well, I think you probably know what to do. And then in the upper left quadrant, this one's also can be a little tricky. You got a high performer, they're getting things done, but their attitude isn't great. They're hard to work with. And they're just a pain in the butt and they're burning bridges. No one else likes working with them. So you got to give that person a reality check and yourself a reality check. Will this person fit into the organization? Now, here's the interesting thing. We all want to be in that upper right corner, right? We all want to be there, but there's often obstacles that get in the way, right? Your job should be to identify what your person has to work on and then move them into the upper right quadrant, where if they have to work on something from an aptitude standpoint, great, work on that with them. If they have to work on their attitude, great, work on that with them. Then ask yourself, but what's the obstacle in the way of getting them to that upper right quadrant? You see, because when you do that, this now takes on a different flavor. This now becomes not just the aptitude attitude model, it now becomes what's also known as the skill, will, hill model, where you ask yourself, what's the skill, the aptitude they need to work on? Is there a will problem, an attitude problem? And what's the hill into getting them into that upper corner? What's the obstacle or the hill? It becomes the skill, will, hill model. That's the first thing that people most often look for help on, pinpointing what other people should work on. Let's move on to the next thing now, which is, okay, great, Scott. How do I give feedback? Giving feedback is really hard, especially to difficult employees. We'll cover both of those things. I want to share with you what I call the Shares Feedback Framework. It is a proven step-by-step process. Shares is an acronym for all the steps you take one at a time. And here's how I developed it, really. I looked at 15 or 16 of the best feedback framework models out there. Each one of them had some flaws in them. So I built from an agglomeration of all of them, the shares model. I tested it over a period of 5 or 6 years. I keep getting fantastic feedback and it's validated. I think you're really going to like this framework. So the best way to share the framework is we're going to do it through an example, okay? A little role play, if you will. We're going to pretend that I'm your boss, okay? And that I've called you into my office and I'm going to give you feedback on an issue that you have to work on, which is that you're late to meetings too often, you're late to coming into work, and it's beginning to be a problem. And I'm going to give you feedback on that using the Shares Feedback Framework so you can learn exactly how this works. It starts with the situation, right? And I'm going to put my readers on here again, because like I said, I'm getting old. I got to make sure I can read the screen too, right? This is the situation where you're briefly describing the performance shortfall and potential. The situation. So let's role play now. Here's situation, right? So I'm talking to you. I'm giving you feedback. Hey, I want to talk to you about being chronically late. It's become an issue. We've talked about it before, and you'd agree that you would put fixes into place, and things got better for a short period of time, but now you're back to your old habits, right? See what I did there? I set the situation up quickly. We got right to it. If you're giving somebody feedback, you can't take too long or they won't be able to focus. They know you're there to give them feedback. They want to know what the situation is right up front. So you got to do that first. The S in shares. Now it's time for the H. This is where you halo the discussion. And what I mean by that is you halo it with empathy. You express confidence and commitment to this person, right? You even ask, hey, can I give you a little bit more detail on what I'm talking about? And let's talk to it. So let me give you this example. So now the halo part of our discussion, okay, right? So, hey, look, I know there's good reasons for you being late, right? I understand the occasional late arrival, but it's important that we're candid with each other, right? It really is. I care about you, and I'm 100% committed to your success, and I have full confidence that you can address this. Hey, can I give you more details so we can talk this through? Now, notice what I did here. You see, nobody wants to talk to a critic. Everybody wants to talk to an ally. You come across as an ally when you're infusing the talk now, the feedback with empathy. You're haloing it with empathy and underlying care and concern, right? It's one thing to tell somebody that they're missing the mark. It's another thing to help them hit that mark. And you want the person to feel like, oh, this is an ally with me here to get better. Their resistances go down instantly if you can halo that discussion with empathy and understanding. Okay, so now we go on to the A in shares, right? This is where you're going to articulate. And what I mean here is you give details on the performance shortfall or behavior. You got to give details now so the person knows exactly what you're talking about. In our example, hey, the reality is your tardiness, your lateness is now a real problem. Just a couple of instances, some examples. Yesterday, you were 15 minutes late to an important team meeting. And the day before, you were 5 minutes late to a customer call, right? So I've given clear examples now. And we see in our research that one of the places that employees most often kind of wiggle out of responsibility and taking accountability for something they're supposed to be working on is when the boss gives them feedback, but they're not specific enough. It just washes over the employee and they're like, they blow it off because the boss never articulated in specifics what the issue was and examples of what they needed to work on it to fix, right? So SHA, situation, halo, articulate. Now it's time to talk about R, the result. In other words, what is the result that this problem is having on you, on others, on the project, on their career aspiration? So in this case, now I make it clear the result of your tardiness, right? As a result, in that team meeting, I had to hold things up and we had to recover ground to catch you up. Two other people in the meeting, they felt disrespected by you showing up late again. That's not good, right? With a customer call, I could see the customer was visibly annoyed. If this pattern keeps up, honestly, it's not only keeping you from showing up at your professional best, it's also going to impact your candidacy promotion because time management skills are critical for that next level that you aspire to. Right? So see what I've done there? I've haloed it with empathy, but I've been very clear on the result. You can do it with heart, you can do it with emotion and empathy, but you got to make it clear on what the result, that undesirable behavior you're giving them feedback on, is having. And by the way, at this point, people often ask me, Scott, is the shares model only for negative feedback? No, it can also be used for positive feedback. I'm using negative feedback, corrective feedback is probably a better term, as an example because people struggle with that more. Let's go to the E in shares, envision. Now, this is where you actually try to get that person to energize and think about a better outcome. And you want them to think about it. So you literally ask, I would ask you, hey, so what do you think a better energizing outcome would be? And how might we get there? And then you pause and you let them brainstorm and come up with alternate solutions to their behavior. You could jump in at some point. I might jump in, if you're struggling for ideas and thoughts, and I might say, okay, you were late to the team meeting because you were in another meeting with legal, for example, right? As an example of how to handle this differently the next time, let legal or any function you're meeting with for an hour know ahead of time that you have a hard stop at 50 minutes so that you got 10 minutes to transition to the next meeting. You get the point, right? I've now joined you as an ally, giving you examples so that we together can envision a better outcome. Now you go to the S. This is where you solicit input. And go ahead and hit click again. And you're going to see a series of arrows come up on the screen because when I say solicit, this is where you're soliciting their feedback. But you don't just save it for the end. You also do it at each stage. If you think you'll get through the entire discussion, this entire shares discussion, and the other person won't say anything, that's probably not going to happen. And I'm not trying to say that it will. More than likely, you're going to want to give them a chance after every letter, every stage. Hey, do you understand what I'm saying? Can I get your input on that, right? Then when you solicit at the tail end, the S in shares, the second S, this is where you want to close and solicit, overall. Like, hey, so overall, what do you think of what we talked about? What's a specific plan of action that I can solicit from you that you can put in place that you're highly confident you could commit to, right? Shares. I promise you, practice it. It makes a huge difference. Tell your employees you're practicing a new framework. Keep the share structure in front of you and practice it. It becomes habit over time. Now, go to the next slide because there's a quick thing that I want to just kind of point out. People often say, okay, Scott, but what about really hard, difficult employees that don't take feedback well? They don't listen well. They get upset at the slightest sign of feedback. Here's a little extra notes in what you see in red on the screen. Remember, at the share stage, stick to the facts without emotion, especially with difficult employees. Just lay out the facts quickly so they know what you're talking about. In the halo stage, you got to make sure that you're genuine. They'll smell it a mile away if you're not, especially kind of difficult employees to work with, right? In the A stage, you want to get very specific, like we talked. You don't want to let them off the hook. If they're being difficult, they might use that. Oh, you weren't specific enough to get off the hook. You can't let them. R, be clear on the consequences with the result, right? It's really important, especially with difficult employees. And I say this with love in my heart, right? You have to be very clear on, but if you don't fix this, these are the consequences of what will happen. And yes, I'm here to fix that with you, but please understand that, right? You also have to when you envision, you really have to make sure that you give them a chance to lead the thinking. And when you solicit at the end, you got to close strong. Sometimes I would backtrack right at the end of a feedback meeting when I was a young middle manager. And I would go through the shares process. And then at the end, in an effort to make it feel good, I would kind of unwind what I just talked about. But hey, overall, you're doing great. Now state, and it would confuse them, right? Stick to your point, close firm on what you're saying, what you're giving them feedback on, but supportive. Those are some great tips for managing down to your organization. One last piece for you, right? Leading from the middle is about leading up, down, and across. And you'll find in the book, this next document, next structure, if you will, what I call the pillars of peer influence. And you're going to see several different pillars. I'm not going to get into them all here. You're going to see if you want to really be able to lead those over whom you have no formal authority, right? You have to build the right reputation. There's certain things your peers are looking for that draw them to you. You have to make unexpected investments in them, like coaching them and being willing to tell their boss when they're doing great on the things that are important in their function. You have to be able in that third pillar to hardwire their help, do favors for them so that it creates a sense of reciprocation. So you're able to influence them right back. You got to get the approach right in how you come at them so that they'll want to collaborate with you so you have more influence over them. There's also two foundational elements you'll see on the chart. You have to cultivate a connection and you have to engage in what I call the golden rule of influence. And out of all of this that you see here, I just have time as we close out here to focus on the foundational golden rule of influence. This is maybe the most important thing I can tell you here very quickly in how to increase your ability to influence those over whom you have no formal authority. It's called the golden rule of influence, and it simply says this. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think of somebody in your life who has tremendous influence over you, but that you don't formally report to, right? They're not your boss or your boss's boss. I want you to picture that person. It could be anybody in your life, right? Okay, so let's say you have that person in your mind. I guarantee you the reason why that person is so influential is because they do one of, if not all four of, the following four things. They care about you. They listen to you. They have given you something, or they teach you something. That's it. If you can show up as caring, listening, giving, or teaching something to the peers around you, you will have great influence on them. It is the golden rule of influence. Influence as you yourself are quite often influenced, even when you don't realize these are the four reasons why you may be being influenced. That's the up, down, and across. Folks, I've been talking from the award-winning book, Leading from the Middle. Again, the subtitle is A Playbook, and it really is a very specific playbook packed with tools for managers to lead up, down, and across the organization. In the book, it gets into the unique challenges, the mindset and the skill set of the most talented middle managers, how very specifically in-depth to lead up to your boss, down to your employees, across to teams and to your peers, and how to lead change. And if you want to check it out, go to scottmautz.com and you'll find a bunch of different ways you can order the book there. Very proud of it. Years of research went into it. I humbly say I think it's award reading for a reason. I think you're going to find it to be a really powerful enabler to help you lead even more potently from the middle. Now, I want to give you some more tools, though. So, I would love it if you would be willing to support me and check out my book at scottmautz.com. I also want to give you some free tools. If you're interested, just send me an email at scottmautz.com. And in the subject title of the email, put all in caps, Podbean tools with no spaces on it, like you see on the screen here. You can take a picture of this, do it later. I have a kind of an auto send thing set up where you'll get the key slides from today's talk. You'll get a toolkit that accompanies the book Leading from the Middle. It's a workbook with things that you can fill out, with exercises and tools inside it, and cheat sheets that give you some of the best content from the book in a print-outable format you can carry around with you and make it into signs and little index cards and things like that. So a real toolkit to help you get the most out of the book Leading from the Middle. And it'll even sign you up for an award-winning weekly blog that I write called Lead On. It gives you weekly tips on how to lead from the middle and just how to lead yourself in general. And I think you're going to find it to be of great value. So we'll close on this, kind of how we started, which is, look, it's a jungle out there in that workplace, right? And you're right in the thick of it, right in the middle where the action is as a middle manager, but you're not stuck in the middle. You have a chance to lead brilliantly in every direction, up, down, and across the organization. To me, that's a badge of pride. Speaking of which, I guess that makes all you a pride of lions, the kings and queens of the jungle, not just monkeys in the middle. Thanks for the opportunity to present with you all that I've learned about the heroes that are middle managers.
Scott, that was just so fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. Wow. I think for everyone out there who's joined, if you have questions, like we mentioned, pop them in the chat here. And Scott and our team here from Podbean will answer them. And it's been such a treat because here at Podbean with our enterprise solution, the use case of internal secure podcasting is a lot of the value that you're providing as a thought leader, as a keynote speaker, and someone who's done years of research and has years of experience as a leader. So thank you, Scott, so much for joining us. It just has been such a pleasure. As Scott mentioned, if you email him directly, and we'll also have a link there in the show notes if you want to reach out directly to Scott. My name is Norma Jean Belenke. I am our head of events here at Podbean. I'm going to read our brief outro and then we're going to wrap up today. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has just been such a pleasure. And I think just so much value and so many takeaways, so many valuable takeaways, Scott. Oh my gosh.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here, Team Podbean. It's been my pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our Corporate Podcasting Smarter March live event, The Power of Influence, Strategies for Effective Leadership with Scott Mautz, leadership expert, keynote speaker, and author of Leading from the Middle. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter and Corporate Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasting, business, and management experts. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast, so make sure to check those out. If you join late or you want to have another listen to this conversation, you can replay this live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel, and we'll have it up on the Podcasting Smarter podcast. Corporate Podcasting Smarter is brought to you by Podbean. We're a private podcast hosting solution for Fortune 100 companies with secure encrypted podcasting and a proven track record within the industry. Head over to podbean.com/enterprise to learn more about our business and enterprise solutions. Thank you so much for joining us.